taken me 25 years of being in the world of business is to discover that just as important as the facts are people's perceptions of those facts. Unless you're able to put yourself in their shoes, understand the way they see the situation, you're never going to be that effective at either making a deal or settling a dispute. And the key way of putting yourself in their shoes, of stepping to their side, is to listen. It's the simplest. I remember once being in a union management negotiation, one which was very difficult, which had led to a strike in the previous time, and it looked like it was going towards a strike again. But there was a breakthrough in the negotiations. Things started to get more positive. And if you looked for the moment of that breakthrough, it was when one side, in this case the union, began to listen. Instead of reacting to what management said, instead of arguing with management, they said, "Tell us some more about what you mean." That's when the conversation shifted. Listening is key. If you actually observe the practice of successful negotiators, you'll find that they actually listen far more than they talk. We often think the best negotiator is the best talker, but really the best negotiator is the best listener. And that's why it's useful, for instance, as a practical technique. We often appoint a spokesperson, someone on our team who's going to speak. It's just as important to appoint a listener. It's all part of putting yourself in their shoes. Up on the other side's shoes is to understand their culture. Culture, after all, is a language. It's a communication system. And if you don't understand it, you're not going to get that far in a negotiation. I remember one incident where a large American automobile manufacturer, the vice president of this company, had a meeting with his Korean partner who owned an automobile company there in Korea. And the American company was interested in increasing its share. It had 10% of this Korean company. It wanted to increase its share to 50%. And the vice president asked his Korean colleague, the president of the Korean company, if this was possible. And the answer came back from the Korean president, that is not impossible. So the American went back to Detroit. He got all organized. He sent a high-level team over to Seoul to have a meeting to discuss buying 40%, an extra 40% of the Korean company. Well, they couldn't even have a meeting with their Korean counterparts. They were always excuses, and they were chasing their Korean counterparts around Seoul for 2 weeks until finally some kindly Korean took them aside and explained to them that that is not impossible in Korean culture means over my dead body. Never. In fact, the Korean president had no interest in selling that 40%. He was just being polite and not saying no. That underscores the importance of putting yourself in the other side's shoes, understanding their culture, their language, if you're going to negotiate effectively. Now, you've gone to the balcony. You've stepped to their side. In other words, we've dealt with the people aspect of the negotiation. Now we have to deal with the problem. We've been soft on the people, now we have to be hard on the problem. What does hard on the problem mean? Hard on the problem doesn't mean what we often think it means, which means being hard on your positions, really asserting your positions rigidly. Hard on the problem rather means being hard in asserting your interests, not your positions. Now, this distinction between interests and positions is the most critical distinction in problem-solving negotiation. It may sound like it's the same thing. It's what you want. Your position is what you want. Your interests are what you want. But there's a critical distinction. And maybe the best way to illustrate that distinction is with the example of the two sisters who were quarreling about an orange. They had an orange, and each sister wanted the orange. They had a big quarrel about it, and so finally in the end, they took a knife and they cut the orange in half so that each sister had half of an orange. Now, one sister took her half, peeled it, and used the peel for baking a cake. The other sister took her half, peeled it, and ate the fruit. So they ended up with a half a peel for one and a half a fruit from the other, when they might very well if they had looked behind the position of the orange for what were the underlying interests in cooking and in eating, they might very well have ended up with a whole peel for one and a whole fruit for the other. And that's often, in that simple example, that's what we often do in negotiation, is we end up dividing the orange and ending up with less than what we might otherwise have ended up with. That's the importance of always focusing behind positions, what people say they want. Positions are their demands. It's the money, it's the numbers, it's the quota. Always focusing behind the positions for what actually are the underlying interests, which are people's concerns, their needs, their desires, their aspirations, their fears. In this case, it was cooking and eating, so that you can then end up with the equivalent of a whole peel for one and a whole fruit for the other. The place to be hard in a negotiation is to be hard in asserting your interests in cooking and eating, rather than to be hard on the position of wanting that orange. Let me give you an example from business. I was once mediating a discussion between a union and management. The most bitter issue between them was the issue of outsourcing jobs. For the company wanted the ability to outsource jobs to other companies that were non-union companies. The company said this was absolutely necessary. Their position was, yes, we need it. And the union's position was no. And it seemed like this situation would lead to a strike. But when we looked behind each side's positions, when we asked the magical question, why is it that you need that? We asked management, why do you need outsourcing? The interest behind it was they wanted flexibility. They wanted the flexibility to meet customer demand when it went up and when it went down. And they wanted the ability to maintain or even enhance their position in the global marketplace. When we asked the union why they didn't want outsourcing, why that was their position, they said their interest was security. They were concerned about losing their jobs. So then the problem became not outsourcing yes or no, but how do we simultaneously meet management's interest in flexibility and the union's interest in security? And by focusing on their interests, they were then able to come up with some creative ideas that later got reflected in the settlement. That's the power of looking behind positions for the underlying interests. That's the third principle in this negotiation methodology. Why it's so important to focus on interests is to be able to take advantage of the single greatest opportunity that you have as a negotiator, which is to invent options for mutual gain. Instead of seeing the pie as fixed, what you find successful negotiators do is they expand the pie first before they divide it up. They do that by being creative. Imagine that in any negotiation that you're involved in, there's a pile of gold on the table in front of you. That gold represents the joint gain that both sides can have if only they can agree on one thing. How do we divide it up? How do we divide up the gold? Yet time and again, if you look at negotiations, people walk away from the table without an agreement, leaving all the gold still on the table, or they walk away with agreements where they only take part of the gold away. They leave much of the gold still on the table. Now, how do you get the gold off the table? The way to do that is to be creative. Let me give you an example. A number of years ago, there was a negotiation in the United States, and it involved the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon was hard to see at the time. There was air pollution that created a haze. The community got aroused. The government got involved. They passed a regulation saying that the plant, there was a coal-fired plant 100 miles away, that it needed to essentially meet a certain air quality standard every month that was going to be measured every month. To do that, the company had to buy 2 scrubbing machines, each one costing millions. The company was very unhappy. The environmentalists were also unhappy because they thought that the level, the standard, was not high enough. Normally, this kind of issue would have been fought out in courts and in litigation for years, except that through a creative conversation, both sides got together, the company and the environmentalists, and they began to negotiate. They began to look at the interests of each side, and they began to invent options for mutual gain. And they discovered that, in fact, if you didn't measure the air quality every month, if you didn't have to do that, but only measured it on an average over the year, that under that case, the company was willing to meet a much higher air level standard because they would only have to buy one scrubbing machine. So they would save a lot of money. They were very happy. The environmentalists were happy because the air quality over the year was higher. And the community was happy because they could see the Grand Canyon again. It was a triple win. A win for the community, a win for the company, and a win for the environmentalists. That's what you're trying to get at when you're engaged in inventing options for mutual gain. Now, how do you do that? I got my first lesson in how to do that many years ago when I had a chance to go to Geneva to visit the arms control negotiations that were taking place between the Soviets and the Americans. And I sat down with them and, I said, how do you reach agreements here? Because they had a very centralized, rigid form of negotiation. Each side essentially just read their position papers at each other. And that was the way in which they negotiated. And I asked them, how do you break impasses? How do you break deadlocks? And they said, well, in the old days, the way that we got to agreements was we had an informal institution that we called the Wizards. And the Wizards were 2 Americans and 2 Russians who had 4 characteristics. They were bilingual in English and Russian. They were technically knowledgeable about the subject arms control. They were lower level than the ambassador. They couldn't make any decisions. And hence, as they joked, they were disposable. And whenever there was a problem in the negotiations, these 4 would get together at some restaurant in Geneva or on the ferry boat in the lake, and they would brainstorm. They would think about, well, how are we going to count the warheads this way? How are we going to do it that way? And they came up with a lot of options, each side knowing full well that neither side had the ability to commit because both sides were under the level of the ambassador. And the joke about being disposable was that if one side went too far, you could always ship them back to Moscow or Washington and say it was all a mistake. And a lot of the breakthroughs in the arms control negotiations came out of these informal conversations. So that's the challenge that we all face in a negotiation, is we need to become wizards. We need to find ways to separate the process of deciding, which is what the ambassadors did, from the process of inventing, which is what the wizards were doing, so that everyone can feel free to invent many options. You need to invent as many options as you can. You need to go to places, perhaps, that are informal. Every negotiation needs those informal venues, whether it's at a restaurant, or over a drink, or in the corridor, or at a retreat setting in the countryside, where people can get together and start to think, what are some wild ideas? What are some creative ways of arriving at a mutually satisfactory agreement? So the challenge, essentially, is for both sides to get side by side, face the problem, and see if you can get all that gold off the table. If inventing options is about expanding the pie, there still remains the problem of how you divide up the pie. How do you deal with differences, opposed interests? What if the customer wants to buy the product for a lower price and you want them to pay a higher price? What if you want a larger size of the company budget and so does the head of the other department?